Discovery, go and throttle up.
Discovery rocket, go for deploy.
Thank you, everybody in the shuttle program. The crew is go for launch.
Roger, nice to be in orbit.
We have followed in their footsteps to get us where we are today.
Hello, and thanks for tuning in to the NASA SpaceX Crew-9 mission, a long-duration rotational mission to the International Space Station for NASA astronaut Nick Hague and Roscosmos cosmonaut Aleksandr Gorbunov. I'm Ronnie Foreman, a senior commercial sales manager here at SpaceX, and I'm joined by NASA's Leah Cheshire. We are just under a couple hours away from the final approach and docking of Dragon to the International Space Station. Overall, this will be Dragon's 44th visit to the space station and its 13th human spaceflight mission to the orbiting lab.
Looking back over the last 24 hours, launch day preparations started early for our crew members. About 4 hours prior to launch, the crew completed their final medical checks before joining the SpaceX team to get into those spacesuits. After suit up in the NASA operations and checkout building, the crew walked out, waving some final farewells to their family and friends waiting outside. That's always one of my favorite parts of the day. Of course, the next destination for the crew was the launch pad. It takes about 20 minutes to ride to Launch Complex 40, where the Falcon 9 and Dragon spacecraft were waiting for them. Of course, a reminder, this was the very first human launch from Launch Complex 40. About 2.5 hours prior to launch, the crew ingressed or entered the Dragon spacecraft, walking over that crew access arm and enjoying some last views of the Space Coast. Love that one of them taking in the rocket itself before they headed into the White Room and then, as you can see here, into the spacecraft.
Then at 10:17 a.m. Pacific time, 1:17 p.m. Eastern time, the 9 Merlin 1D engines ignited and Falcon 9 lifted off from the first time with crew on board from LC-40, marking the 15th time humans rode Dragon into orbit. With Falcon 9's first stage at full power, our crew began their journey to the International Space Station. Just about T+8 minutes into that mission, our first stage returned to Earth and landed at Landing Zone 1. A couple of minutes after that, we had spacecraft separation where we saw Dragon finally flying free with Crew-9 on board.
About 45 minutes after liftoff at 11:03 a.m. Pacific, Dragon executed the phase burn. This is the first of 5 major burns required to raise Dragon's orbit and position it for approach to the International Space Station. Dragon raised its orbit using the Draco thrusters over the last several hours as it continues to chase down its destination, the space station.
And then just a few hours ago, the boost burn took place at 7:58 p.m. Pacific time. The boost burn put our crew in an orbit where Dragon's apogee, or the highest point of the orbit, is about 10 kilometers lower than the station. But before we can approach the station, we need Dragon's entire orbit, not just that highest point, to be effectively shadowing the space station. So after that, we executed the close co-elliptic burn at 8:42 p.m. Pacific. The close burn placed Dragon on an orbit roughly co-elliptic with the space station, meaning that it's maintaining an orbit roughly 10 kilometers lower than the station the entire way around the Earth. Again, that's in contrast to only being 10 kilometers lower than the station during the apogee, or the highest point in the orbit, which is what was achieved by the boost burn beforehand.
Now from there, this morning at 7:54 a.m. Pacific time, we executed the 4th major maneuver known
Freedom
as...
copies go, 2001 Zulu.
And that was good news from the crew. It sounded like Commander Nick Hague aboard Dragon. They just got the go for the approach initiation burn. We're tracking that in a little less than 30 minutes now. However, let's rewind a little bit. This morning, we did execute the transfer burn, 7:54 a.m. Pacific time. That's where we raised Dragon's apogee, or the highest point of its orbit, to just 2.5 kilometers lower than the station. Then we rounded everything out with a final co-elliptic burn at 8:41 a.m. Pacific to once again maintain that constant orbit lower than the station, this time just 2.5 kilometers below. That was a shorter burn lasting just over 30 seconds. And recently at 11:30 a.m. Pacific, we added in the approach out of plane burn to further refine Dragon's trajectory to the space station.
During our approach, SpaceX flight controllers will work in tandem with the NASA team in Houston to maneuver Dragon Freedom to the proper altitude. They will initialize the navigation sensors used for this methodical approach to the space station. They'll also activate and test out a number of systems on board Dragon, including the bidirectional communications system with the station using the C2V2 system. C2V2 stands for Common Communications for Visiting Vehicles. It sets up a data stream from Dragon to the space station, giving us another path for Dragon telemetry to come to the ground, and giving an additional command capability to astronauts aboard the space station.
At approximately 1:01 p.m. Pacific time, the Draco thrusters on Dragon will fire for the approach initiation burn when Dragon is about 2.5 kilometers below the station and just about 7 kilometers behind it. This will swing Dragon up until it's about a quarter mile, around 400 meters, directly below the station. Now, this maneuver also moves Dragon inside one of 2 checkpoints around the station that requires a set of go, no-go poles with the different control teams. The first checkpoint is called the approach ellipsoid, or you might hear us call it, or the crew call it, the AE. That's an imaginary shape measuring 4 kilometers by 2 by 2 kilometers. It's essentially a large 3-dimensional oval. Before Dragon is given permission to move inside the approach ellipsoid, the capsule is configured to be on what is known as a 24-hour safe trajectory. That means that if Dragon lost all control to its thrusters, it would be at least 24 hours before its trajectory would move it inside the approach ellipsoid.
The NASA and SpaceX teams will do a go, no-go poll to move Dragon inside the keep-out sphere, another checkpoint that consists of an imaginary sphere around the space station with a radius of 200 meters. Flight controllers use this to monitor all arriving and departing vehicles. This is another chance to confirm all of the guidance, navigation, and control systems are working correctly on Dragon before moving closer to the station. It also carries a similar requirement on orbital trajectory. If Dragon were to somehow lose control of its thrusters, it and the space station would be safe for 4 orbits, or about 6 hours, rather than the 24 hours required to enter the approach ellipsoid. Once Dragon arrives at 400 meters below the station, it will be at what's known at waypoint 0. That will be our first checkpoint during our approach. The vehicle can hold here at 400 meters if needed, but if all of the systems check out, Dragon can continue its approach to waypoint 1.
Dragon's move from waypoint 0 to waypoint 1 will swing it up and out in front of the station, arriving at a distance of approximately 220 meters. At this point, it'll be on what we call the docking axis. That essentially means it's directly in front of the docking port. Crew-9 today is headed to the forwardmost port on station, so known as Node 2 forward. Dragon has docked to Node 2, also known as Harmony, for all of our crewed missions so far, because that's where both international docking adapters are located, installed for these new commercial spacecraft flights, as well as any other future spacecraft that use the international docking standard.
Once Dragon is just 20 meters away at waypoint 2, the spacecraft focuses on aligning its docking system with the international docking adapter. We may hear the call-out CHOP, which stands for Crew Hands-Off Point, a little less than 30 seconds before docking. At that point, any aborts will have to be done automatically by Dragon.
And of course, the grand arrival today is when our crew arrives at the space station. Dragon will fly in and make contact with the International Docking Adapter, or the IDA, and that gives us what we call soft capture. The soft capture ring will then retract until sensors indicate it's time for 12 hooks to drive in place and give us a hard capture, and for firmly secure Dragon to its new home on the space station. Now, the station crew, namely Jeanette Epps, the NASA astronaut, will manually pressurize the vehicle, or the vestibule, and that's the area between the Dragon hatch and the station hatch. Meanwhile, the umbilicals that provide power, audio, and data connections from the station to Dragon are put in place. And then it'll be time for leak checks and hatch opening, which is currently timelined to come a little more than 2 hours following docking. So sounds like we are on target today for a docking around 4:30 p.m. Central, so 2:30 p.m. Pacific time.
Everything looking great from Mission Control, but hard to imagine our Crew-9 astronauts have been in transit this entire time since they launched about 26 hours ago.
Yeah, and they've had some free time to kind of do as they please on the space station. On Dragon. Now they have the opportunity to eat some meals. They get out of those suits and the seats where we last saw them yesterday, get a little comfortable. I heard they were looking out the window and enjoying the views. Obviously, who wouldn't? They also have a sleep period, and so they woke up a little bit before 3 a.m. Pacific time today. So they are already shifting their schedule to be a little more aligned with the schedule on the International Space Station.
That also would not be a bad view to wake up to. We're getting some of those early views on your screen right now of the light just coming over the edge of the Earth, which is pretty exciting to see.
Yeah, let's take a look. It looks like the International Space Station itself is now flying about 260 statute miles over Algeria. So as we get into more of an orbital daytime, we should be able to see Dragon approaching the station below it. And as we joined the broadcast today, that bright dot on the screen, that was actually the International Space Station from Dragon. So they have been able to see each other for a couple of hours now, which I know must be exciting to see your final destination in the frame.
Yeah, that's great. And closer to our Expedition 72 crew coming together.
Yeah, we will have 11 astronauts on board once Nick and Aleksandr arrive today. And in total, that puts us at 14 people in low Earth orbit, because we'll have the 11 on the International Space Station. And there's also a Chinese space station that has 3 more people on it. So 14 people off of the Earth right now.
That's great. I'm certainly staying in close communication with them, both through Mission Control here at SpaceX and in Houston.
And of course, these teams are monitoring different things. So far we've had Dragon, or the mission control team here in Hawthorne, monitoring the Dragon spacecraft itself. They've been doing that since launch yesterday, really since before launch yesterday, making sure everything was go for that on-time liftoff. Again, coming at 10:17 a.m. Pacific time. But over in Houston, we do have a whole separate team monitoring the space station itself. Now, they're monitoring everything from Dragon's trajectory to the solar arrays, making sure that they are locked in place. Right now, we have some crew members that are exercising aboard the space station. They'll be asked to refrain from exercise while the Dragon spacecraft arrives and that docking process begins, just so we don't impart any additional loads on the space station or on Dragon during that time.
Great views on your screen now of Mission Control here in SpaceX. Of course, we have Mission Control staffed to follow the safety of our Crew-9 astronauts the entire time that they are on orbit, from liftoff from, again, Slick 40 yesterday, all the way through docking today, all the way through their return to Earth early next year with the full Crew-9 contingent on board.
Now we're less than 20 minutes away from that approach initiation burn. That is also putting us in what we call proximity operations, and the International Space Station is already transitioning into that time frame. But we'll also hear some call outs to configure the big loop. So what we hear on the ground, we've heard Dragon to ground this entire time. We really haven't heard the calls from the crew aboard the International Space Station down to the ground. But once we configure the big loop, it puts everybody on the same communications channel so that they can all talk at the same time as we get into these integrated operations.
One of the cool things about a mission like this really is that we are in touch with people around the world supporting these astronauts. So the big loop, depending on how you define it, is really pretty big, including Mission Control here in SpaceX, of course, NASA Houston, and the International Space Station.
Now, while we wait for our next milestone, let's take a moment to meet our crew. U.S. Space Force Colonel Nick Hague is your Crew-9 commander. He was selected by NASA as an astronaut in 2013, and this is his second spaceflight to the International Space Station. In 2018, he and his Soyuz crewmate experienced a catastrophic rocket booster malfunction after launch. They were forced to abort, but landed safely. 5 months later, Hague launched on another Soyuz and served as flight engineer for Expeditions 59 and 60. He spent a total of 203 days in space.
SpaceX Freedom from Seat 2, ComCheck.
Loud and clear, Nick, from C2.
I've got you the same.
All right, a little bit more about Nick Hague. He spent a total of 203 days in space previously and performed 3 spacewalks. He's a Kansas native and a test pilot and a distinguished graduate of the United States Air Force Academy. Nick spent 5 months in Iraq with support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. He voluntarily transferred from the United States Air Force to U.S. Space Force in 2021 and is an active colonel. His wife, Katie, is a retired U.S. Air Force colonel as well, and they have 2 sons. To learn a little bit more about Nick, let's take a look at this video.
The point of the human exploration of space is to benefit everyone on Earth. My name's Nick Hague, and I'm the commander for NASA's SpaceX Crew-9 mission to the International Space Station. Space is really hard. It's dynamic, it's unpredictable, and we've seen that play out over the last several months. But that's no different than the way it's always been. And so it's phenomenal to be part of a team that you see them respond to that and throw themselves at these new challenges and figure out ways to make it happen. It just makes you really proud to be part of the NASA team. I grew up on a farm out in western Kansas, looking up at the night sky, staring at the stars, dreaming about exploring space. At some point when you're growing up, the childhood dream of going to space transitions to a professional ambition. And for me, that time was at the test pilot school at Edwards Air Force Base. I've been to the space station before. My first launch was not quite successful, and we aborted about 2 minutes into the flight. So what was supposed to be a 200-day mission ended up being a 20-minute mission. I was able to try again 5 months later and complete the job that I was asked to do, which was go to the space station and spend 6 months on board. So I was part of expeditions 59 and 60. Our mission hasn't changed. It's to get to the space station, conduct research, and come home. How we're going to do that is going to look a little bit different. This time, we're going to launch with just 2 crew. We're going to have 2 empty seats for Butch and Sunny, so that at the end of our mission, we're going to be able to bring them home. But one of the most exciting and challenging aspects of what lie ahead is how Alex and I are going to integrate into their crew. You know, they've been on the station for several months already, and it's going to be thrilling to be able to join them and get to work, doing that mission of discovery, conducting science, performing upgrades on the station, figuring out how to live and work, not just in low Earth orbit, but how we're going to do that when we go to the moon and on to Mars. Safety culture at NASA is so critical. We manage risk every day. Just being able to watch the agency navigate those decisions over the last several months and balance the risk and the safety of the crew and the well-being of the crew and the vehicle and the mission has been phenomenal. What is crystal clear in that entire process is the commitment to making sure that when we launch crews, we're going to bring them home safe.
You say that too.
Go ahead on to Matt.
You're confused by my last call. It's because it was unnecessary. That's a for reference procedure if we are not using tasknet. So disregard, please.
We copy, and it definitely doesn't hurt. So thanks for the clarification.
Good discussions there between mission control and our crew up in orbit. Next up, of course, we have mission specialist Aleksandr Gorbunov. This is his first time in space aboard Crew-9, but of course has been preparing for this flight for much of his career. He studied engineering with qualifications in spacecraft and upper stages from the Moscow Aviation Institute. Gorbunov graduated from the military department with a specialty in operation and repair of aircraft, helicopters, and aircraft engines. Before his
SpaceX for Big Loop contracts.
Freedom's with you.
All right, I can confirm that the bidirectional link has been established. You are go to change your push-to-talk destination to ISS and initiate a comm check with SpaceX, Houston, and station.
And copy that. And then just for clarity, stay on this the rest of the time.
Affirm, I will be with you on space to ground the rest of the time through docking.
Okay, copy. So I'll if I want to talk to you, you're on space to ground. Otherwise, from here on out, after we do the comm checks, we'll press with Big Blue comm, or like we're going to do the suitlink checks over space to ground.
Space to ground. So everything will be Big Loop from now on, just so you don't have to switch back and forth. So we have Dragon to ground and space to ground. We'll use Big Loop, which is space to ground. So you can keep it configured to ISS as your push-to-talk destination for the remainder of approach.
Okay, just making sure. All right, switching over.
All right, a little back and forth between our crew.
Freedom on the big blue. Com check.
SpaceX has you loud and clear on the big loop. How me?
Got you the same. Houston, Freedom on the big loop. Com check.
Freedom, Houston has you loud and clear. How me?
Can catch you loud and clear, Houston. And station, Freedom, com check on the big loop.
Freedom, this is Station. We've got you loud and clear, Nick and Alex. We are waiting for you.
Loud and clear. Can't wait to get there.
And tally ho, we got you in the window.
Freedom, SpaceX on the big loop. We'll call that comm checks complete. We will stay on this loop for the remainder of approach. All comms.
Freedom copy. Big loop on from here on out.
All right, we did hear those big loop communication checks complete. So we were just talking about the big loop. That is essentially this communications loop that allows all 4 parties to speak with each other at the same time. So for the past 24-ish hours, Dragon has been speaking to the core here in Hawthorne, but not radioing anything to the space station. And the space station has been speaking with the Capcom, or the capsule communicator in Houston, but not necessarily talking to Dragon. So once we get into these proximity operations, when Dragon is getting closer to the space station, that allows us to configure this loop where everyone can talk to each other at the same time. And we did hear that both Dragon, Freedom, and the space station are pretty excited to be able to see each other. So we are, again, coming up on that approach initiation burn that's really going to set things into motion this morning in just about 9 minutes now.
It's really exciting. And you can also hear that enthusiasm from the astronauts on board the International Space Station as they make that confirmation of contact over the big loop with Crew-9 on board Dragon right now. Returning a little bit to the history of Aleksandr Gorbunov's path to flight today. Before his cosmonaut selection in 2018, he worked as an engineer for a rocket space corporation and helped support cargo spacecraft launches from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Let's hear a little bit more about his career from Aleksandr himself.
Практически самое неизвестное, что сейчас у нас есть. Поэтому мы все время стараемся изучить этот космос как можно больше, изучить, как устроена Вселенная. Исходя из этих знаний, этих фундаментальных знаний, мы, может быть, получим в дальнейшем какие-то новые технологии. My name is Aleksandr Gorbunov, and I'm the mission specialist for NASA's SpaceX Crew-9 mission to the International Space Station. Я родился в городе Железногорске, Курской области. Это примерно в 500 километрах на юг от Москвы. Мне нравилась, например, биология. И когда я был совсем маленьким ребенком, я хотел быть биологом. Затем я познакомился с авиамоделированием. После этого меня мысль о том, чтобы стать инженером, в частности в космической отрасли, полностью захватила. И в старших классах я уже осознанно готовился. Я закончил Московский авиационный институт по направлению космические летательные аппараты и разгонные блоки. По образованию я инженер. Учась в институте, я также параллельно работал. После этого я поставил себе цель попасть в отряд космонавтов. На это ушло примерно 10 лет. В 2018 году я был отобран в отряд космонавтов. Международная кооперация – это одна из самых важнейших частей при исследовании космоса. Мне кажется, что когда человек выходит за пределы земных атмосфере, то он становится не только представителем своего государства или своей нации, но также представителем всего человечества. Когда я учился в институте, то ходил в горные походы, в зимние походы, научился нырять с аквалангом. Но самое вдохновляющее увлечение, которое у меня сохранилось до сих пор, это парапланеризм. Это невероятное, непередаваемое ощущение, когда ты летишь, и тебя сопровождает только звук ветра. Но я думаю, это похожее увлечение. С каждым годом все выше и выше. Чем больше занимаешься парапланеризмом, тем выше получается подняться на параплане. Соответственно, следующая ступень — космос, но без параплана.
Now, a lot of work has been done on the space station before we got to today to make sure we were launching Dragon and this new crew to a fully functional orbital laboratory. After the post-sleep period this morning, the crew got right into preparing for Dragon arrival. NASA astronauts Matt Dominic and Mike Barrett will be in the station's cupola, that bay window looking down on Earth, using special software to track Dragon's approach and make sure it's staying in the expected zones.
Once Dragon is docked, Jeanette Epps will be primed to move right into hatch operations. She'll start by opening the large hatch at Node 2 forward, giving her access inside the pressurized mating adapter.
The crew will then have to pressurize the vestibule. That's the small space between the hatches on Dragon and the space station. That vestibule is exposed to vacuum prior to docking, so the crew will need to fill it with air and make sure its pressure is nearly equal with the atmospheric pressures on Dragon and on the station. Epps will use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the vestibule. Flight controllers here in Houston will monitor the pressure and temperature readings inside and verify that everything is leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches.
Of course, preparation began prior to crew arrival to make sure they have somewhere to stay. The astronauts have available temporary campout locations, known as casas, that they can stay in until we're back to our usual 7 people living and working on station.
Yeah, so we're excited to get those 2 new crew members aboard and bring Expedition 72 up to 11 crew members for handover. So this is what Expedition 72 will look like once we have our Crew 8 return next week. These crew members arrived, obviously, we have Butch and Sunny who arrived on Starliner. We have Nick and Aleksandr who are arriving today on Dragon. And then we have our other 3 crew members, including NASA astronaut Don Pettit, who arrived just a couple of weeks ago on a Soyuz spacecraft, and they are part of Expedition 72. I can't believe we're already up to 72 expeditions now, but we have had humans living and working in space for over 23 years continuously now. So if you are under 23 years old, there has never been a day of your life when all humans have been on the Earth at the same time, which sounds like,
that's awesome.
It's so sci-fi. It sounds like
that's
the future,
really cool.
But it's now. So right now, that Expedition 72 crew aboard the station is awake, and they are preparing for Dragon's approach, and they sound pretty excited about it, too.
Yeah, they do. Speaking of Dragon, development of Dragon for crew started with Dragon carrying cargo. Dragon was designed from the beginning for flying humans to space, so much so that even the first Dragon had a window. Before we could fly humans, teams implemented a number of design upgrades to make sure both Dragon and Falcon 9 are suitable for flying people. Then we put both vehicles through thousands of tests to prove their safety. Dragon is capable of carrying up to 7 passengers to and from Earth orbit and beyond. It is the only spacecraft currently flying that is capable of returning significant amounts of cargo to Earth, and is the first private spacecraft to take humans to the space station. Dragon is fully autonomous, which means it can basically fly itself, but also features full manual override capabilities in case of an emergency.
Now, we did just hear that the approach initiation burn just started, so that is about a 90-second burn. It did come a couple of minutes earlier than we were expecting it today, but so far it seems like everything is going well, and we are standing by for the burn completion. Again, this is really going to set things into motion for us today. This approach initiation burn moves, it happens when Dragon is about 2.5 kilometers below the station, just about 7 kilometers behind it. And that'll swing Dragon up until it's about quarter mile, which is about 400 meters directly below the station.
And of course, each one of these maneuvers are about very gradually approaching station with Dragon, just to make sure that we approach slowly and carefully. Even though these vehicles look like they're moving quite slowly relative to each other, each one is traveling more than 17,000 miles an hour.
Freedom SpaceX on the big loop. Nominal approach initiation maneuver complete.
Freedom copies on the big loop, nominal AI burn, and we are complete with section 5, holding section 6 of suit donning for your go for suit leak checks.
SpaceX copies, holding in section 6. We'll give you a go for suit leak check shortly.
Freedom copies.
All right, we love that word nominal.
Always good.
Everything as expected for the approach initiation burn. Again, about a 90-second burn. That's also eventually going to move Dragon into the approach ellipsoid, one of those invisible spheres or an oval that we monitor as spacecraft arrive and depart the International Space Station. It doesn't matter whether there's crew on board or whether it's a cargo spacecraft. This is kind of our boundaries or our neighborhood around the space station that all the flight controllers keep their eye on for anything that's approaching or departing.
And that really a methodical approach to approaching station was a big part of how Dragon was designed from the very beginning. Like we were talking about earlier, whether it's cargo or crew, we always approach station in a really similar way. Now, speaking of these two vehicles, which are about to meet up in space, even though we had those earlier views where
Freedom SpaceX on the big loop, looking for you're okay to come back on board with cameras.
Freedom. Yeah, we're good with that. Apologies for not having you come on board earlier, but welcome aboard.
Copy.
good news there that we should soon be getting views of our Crew-9 astronauts on board Dragon, suited up and ready to approach the station.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited that we did hear they were putting their suits back on earlier, and so they're going to get into some leak checks and make sure that everything is safe. They'll keep those suits on for the remainder of the approach to the International Space Station, all throughout docking. And then once we complete the docking and we're successfully attached to the space station, they'll have a chance to get out of those suits and probably into their flight suits or something else while we work to pressurize that vestibule and before we open the hatch. So again, we're targeting docking today around, let's see, I believe 1:30 p.m. Pacific time.
Getting close.
I'm trying to work on my my time zones, but I feel like I'm in a bunch of different places.
Well, we're communicating with a bunch of different places between here, Houston. Obviously, we've got the station on Greenwich Mean Time, so we're jumping around across the world a little bit. But the good news is that for our Expedition 72 crew, Dragon is getting bigger in the window as it gets ever closer to the ISS. But Dragon's actually pretty big to begin with. The Dragon spacecraft and its trunk stand over 26 feet tall. There are 2 windows on the spacecraft, plus one under the nose cone. The nose cone opened shortly after launch, so if you were with us yesterday, you heard us call out that major milestone, which allows us to expose the forward bulkhead thrusters and docking mechanism that will connect with the International Space Station. Dragon's trunk holds solar cells, which power Dragon while it's in free flight, and the trunk can also carry unpressurized cargo to the station.
Now, Dragon has 16 Draco thrusters that can be used in space to help navigate the spacecraft to its destination, each providing 90 pounds of force, which really takes you a long way once you're in the vacuum of space. That doesn't include the 8 Super Draco thrusters used for an abort, which are no longer active once the crew is in orbit.
Dragon has played a significant role in advancing our future in space by safely transporting crew to and from the space station. There are currently 4 Dragon spacecraft supporting human spaceflight missions that have docked to the station: Endeavour, Resilience, Endurance, and Freedom. Crew-9 are on board Freedom today, which previously flew NASA's SpaceX Crew-4, in addition to the commercial Axiom missions AX-2 and AX-3.
Altogether, the reusable Dragon spacecraft have completed 8 human spaceflight missions on behalf of NASA and visited the station 42 times under NASA's commercial resupply and commercial crew programs so far. As we mentioned earlier, Crew-9 is Dragon's 15th human spaceflight mission since 2020. Now, that includes these commercial crew program missions for NASA, as well as the private astronaut missions with Axiom, Inspiration 4, and Polaris Dawn, which recently launched. And that is when Dragon became the first private spacecraft to take humans to the International Space Station with Demonstration Mission 2 in 2020. Now, you might be wondering, what do the astronauts do once they get to the International Space Station? And I can tell you they stay extremely busy. So over the last 23 years, crews aboard the space station have completed thousands of scientific and educational experiments, and Crew-9 is prepared to add to that growing number. Crew-9 will conduct hundreds of science experiments and technology demonstrations during their mission, and they will spend several months, I think about 5 months, working on the orbital laboratory. Yeah. Of course, having more crew members on board significantly expands the amount of research that we can conduct, and this crew will conduct new scientific research to prepare for human exploration beyond where we're at now in low Earth orbit and benefit humanity on Earth.
Experiments include studies of blood clotting, effects of moisture on plants grown in space.
SpaceX on the big loop for suit leak checks. We're going to wait to perform the suit leak checks until the other side of an upcoming TDRS handover, so I'll be back with you in about 6 minutes to step into suit leak checks.
Single copies, we'll be ready.
Good news for Mission Control there that we are about to step into those suit leak checks, but we are expecting a slight communications gap in our TDRS coverage. That's the call out you heard, that we're expecting a little bit of a handover with that system. So what we're going to do now is wait before moving into that procedure just to make sure that we have constant communications throughout it. Speaking of things that are happening constantly, back to our experiments on board the station, we're also going to be studying vision changes in astronauts. Those are just a few of more than 200 scientific experiments and technology demonstrations taking place during this mission. These projects span a wide range of disciplines, from life and physical sciences to advanced materials, technology development, in-space production applications, and even student-led research, which are always some of my favorite experiments. Results from those studies will bring value to humanity both on Earth and in space, further our ability to explore, and enable a robust market in low Earth orbit.
So let's break it down a little bit more and talk specifically about some of the experiments that will be happening while Crew-9 is aboard the space station. The megakaryocytes orbiting in outer space and near-Earth research experiment investigates how environmental conditions affect the development and function of megakaryocytes and platelets. I had no idea what megakaryocytes were, but they are large cells found in bone marrow and platelets, and pieces of these cells play important roles in blood clotting and immune response. Results could provide critical knowledge about the risk of changes in inflammation, immune responses, and clot formation in spaceflight, but also here on the ground.
It is amazing to me how different the microgravity environment is, and that it gives us the opportunity to study these Earth-based processes in a way that help our astronauts, but also people here on Earth.
Yeah.
In addition to a lot of those biologically oriented experiments, the Neutron Star Interior Composition Explorer, or NICER telescope for short, on the exterior of the space station measures X-rays emitted by neutron stars and other cosmic objects. Through that, they're helping to answer questions about matter and gravity. In May of 2023, NICER developed a light leak, which is allowing sunlight to interfere with daytime measurements. Special patches have been designed to cover some of that damage, and those will be installed during a future spacewalk, returning the instrument to around-the-clock operations.
And that's a plug for me. If you've never watched a spacewalk, if you've always gotten to watch a launch or a docking, but you've never taken the time to tune in when we have 2 crew members outside of the hatch, I have to encourage it. It is some of the most incredible work from the teams on the ground to the teams on the space station and, of course, the crew members outside. So it sounds like we're going to have some of those coming up to conduct that experiment and that installation. So keep an eye on blogs.nasa.gov or just nasa.gov in general for when you can look to watch any spacewalks. Back to some of the research. Some astronauts experience vision changes, and it's a condition that we call SANS, or spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome. There's a B complex investigation testing whether just a daily B vitamin supplement can prevent or mitigate this problem and assess how genetics may influence individual response. Now, one of those variations could be related to a metabolic pathway that requires B vitamins to function properly. And when we have inefficiencies in this pathway, it can affect the inner lining of blood vessels, and that can result in leaks that actually may contribute to vision changes. So providing B vitamins that are known to affect blood vessel function positively could minimize issues in who we find to be genetically at-risk astronauts.
As people travel farther from Earth for longer, growing food also becomes increasingly important. Scientists conducted many plant growth experiments on the space station using its veggie hardware, including Veg-01B, which demonstrated that outrageous red romaine lettuce is suitable for crop production in space. Plant Habitat 07 uses this lettuce to examine how moisture conditions affect the nutritional quality and microbial safety of plants. The advanced plant habitat controls humidity, temperature, air, light, and soil moisture, creating the precise conditions needed for this experiment.
I absolutely love the veggie experiments. I think they're some of the most visual experiments that we have on the International Space Station. We have grown everything from zinnias. I don't know if you recall when
those are beautiful photos too.
They're so beautiful. If you haven't seen them yet, astronaut Scott Kelly, he spent about a year in space and he grew some zinnias and took some beautiful pictures in the cupola. And it's just such an amazing contrast of, Earth and space. And it's so you can hardly, you can't live in just outer space. And here are these beautiful zinnias inside our beautiful habitat of the space station. So those are amazing. And they've also grown some chili peppers, which
chilies are my favorite. So this is my favorite experiment that's ever been done on space station, just because I think it would be fun to get to grow something and then eat it in space.
Yeah. And of course the lettuce too. Everybody loves a fresh salad. So,
yeah.
I won't say everybody, but I do. Now, there are currently nine astronauts and cosmonauts living aboard the International Space Station. They are Expedition 72. Of course, that includes the 4 Crew-8 members. They arrived in March 2024, and we expect them to return sometime next week. We're still looking at dates and weather and things like that. But stay tuned to nasa.gov for the latest updates on their return. That includes NASA astronauts Matt Dominic, Michael Barrett, and Jeanette Epps, as well as Roscosmos cosmonaut Aleksandr Gorbunov. So when Aleksandr Gorbunov gets there today, we'll have 2 Alexanders on board. And of course, on the Soyuz spacecraft that launched just a couple of weeks ago, we have NASA astronaut Don Pettit, and then Roscosmos cosmonauts Alexei Ovchinin and Ivan Wagner. And a really fun fact about Alexei.
Freedom SpaceX on the big loop for suit leak checks.
Freedom is with you.
All right, Nick, you are go for suit leak checks per 4.011.
Go for suit leak checks. SpaceX Freedom on the big loop. Section 2, 2.2, ready to pressurize.
SpaceX is with you. You are go for commanding 2.3. Initiate suit leak check.
Freedom, Captain, go.
Good news there that our suit leak checks are well underway.
Yeah, again, they do wear these suits. These are still considered dynamic portions of the mission. Like you talked about, these are really moving, the space station and Dragon are moving pretty slowly in relation to one another because you have to have a very slow and methodical approach to the space station. But in reality, they are moving at orbital velocity, so 17,500 miles around Earth. And so during these dynamic phases of flight, we just had the approach initiation burn, and we're getting into docking when we're bringing 2 spacecraft together 260 miles above Earth. We keep our crew suited up and in their seats just in case they needed to take any actions like retreating or breaking out from the space station. But it seems like everything's going pretty smoothly so far.
Yeah, everything is going well today. But one of the cool things about the suits that the astronauts are putting on right now and doing those leak checks on is that they really are designed to keep the astronauts safe in the event of an emergency. The material and everything on board the suits is designed for the off nominal case, so that even though hopefully everything goes the way it is today, really nice and smooth, we're ready for those off nominal scenarios if they were to occur.
And those suits are custom tailored for each crew member. And they also provide different things. So there's an umbilical on the suit that connects to the seat itself. And when they were getting suited up yesterday, there's kind of a little briefcase that it can help connect to as well. And that provides some things like cooling. That's also their communications outlet. So they have the ability to get in those suits and have communications through their helmet. When they are floating around the spacecraft, there is a microphone that they can grab and use at any time. So they don't have to stick their head in the helmet really quickly if they want to talk to somebody. But it does allow continuous communication for the crew with anybody here on the ground.
Which is great because that's how we're able to hear them through the big loop right now. But once they get to the space station, those IVA suits, which stands for intervehicular activity suits, won't be needed anymore. So once they're out of their suits and ready to go on board the ISS, those Dragon spacesuits will stay on board Dragon for the remainder of the mission.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. There's quite a difference between the IVA or intravehicular activity suit, like you mentioned, and the EMU, the extravehicular mobility unit. An EMU is when you think of a spacewalk, a NASA astronauts out on a spacewalk and the International Space Station, you see a bigger, a bulkier suit. That's an EMU. But of course, we did see just a couple of weeks ago the first commercial spacewalk with a new developed spacesuit, and that was still considered an IVA suit. Is that correct, or is it considered?
That's an EVA suit.
Okay.
So that's basically an evolution of SpaceX's IVA suit that was designed specifically for the Polaris Dawn mission in support of that first commercial astronaut spacewalk that has ever been done, which was just, to me, so exciting to see. Because like you mentioned earlier, the spacewalks are, to me, the most exciting part of human spaceflight. You have this amazing communication between the astronauts outside of either the ISS or the capsule, working together, communicating with the ground. And it was great to see that not just on station, like we've seen it many times before and hopefully many times in the future, but also on board Dragon.
Now, again, we did lift off on time yesterday. Just so
on the big loop, 2 good suits.
SpaceX copies and concurs. At this point, we'll consider 4.011 complete, and that should also mean 4.010 complete.
We're tracking the same.
All right, good news. 2 good suit leak checks. That coming from NASA astronaut Nick Hague, who's the commander aboard Dragon right now. Again, 2 suits. It's he and Roscosmos cosmonaut Aleksandr Gorbunov. So we're bringing the station residents up to 11 today.
I feel like that's going to make the station kind of a party for at least the next couple of days.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, check it out. That's the International Space Station, our home in low Earth orbit, and the destination of Dragon today. This point of view coming from Dragon itself. Now, we did hear earlier that the crew aboard the space station can also see Dragon at this time. So as we get a little bit closer, we might be able to see Dragon from the station as well.
And we're getting great views right now inside of Dragon, looking up at those screens as our 2 crew members begin to approach the ISS.
Now, as we mentioned, we are here in Hawthorne at SpaceX, and we have Mission Control Hawthorne just over to our left, monitoring everything aboard the Dragon spacecraft itself. But we have 2 spacecraft in this game today, the other one being the International Space Station in low Earth orbit. So for a little update in that side of the house, I'm going to toss it over to my colleague, Gary.
Hey, Leah and Ronnie, it is so great to be with you. We're over here at NASA's Mission Control Center in Houston, Texas, following along with the operations of Crew-9, Nick Hague and Aleksandr Gorbunov on the way to the International Space Station. We just heard an update that they had a great suit leak check, and we are counting down to the approach initiation mid-course maneuver. This is a maneuver that allows the Dragon spacecraft any course correction maneuvers necessary to align ourselves with the next waypoint, waypoint 0. Right underneath the International Space Station. That allows for the next series of maneuvers, which Leah, you and Ronnie have both went over beautifully to sweep out right in front of the International Space Station in preparation for docking. In the meantime, the teams here in Mission Control Houston are preparing for the docking of the 2 crew members to the International Space Station to bring the orbiting complex's population up to 11. So in the past couple of hours, NASA astronaut Butch Wilmore got a head start on preparing some of the monitoring tools that are necessary from the inside of the International Space Station. While the 2 crew members are approaching the International Space Station, they're going to have help from across the United States, but also from aboard the orbiting complex. It'll be NASA astronauts Mike Barrett as well as Matt Dominic that are in the cupola monitoring the operations of Nick Hague and Aleksandr Gorbunov making their way to the International Space Station. Here in the room, though, we're following along. Teams are led by the flight director, Marcos Flores, who is leading the teams here for the docking operations. The voices that you're going to hear